Frank Sheeran was not a figure people typically expected to become intertwined with the most powerful movers of the underworld, yet he found himself in the center of dark history. His life and experiences would eventually connect him to some of the most notorious kingpins in the United States, especially Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa, in turn, loomed as a significant figure in America's labor movement and true crime stories. Their friendship, fraught with both camaraderie and shadows, added layers to the underworld secrets that defined mid-20th century America. Early life in a changing America, Frank Sheeran was born into circumstances very different from those that awaited him after the war. Before his future in underworld secrets began to unfold, he was just another young man in pre-war America. Like countless others, he soon found himself swept into the tumultuous events of World War II. That global conflict was a proving ground for Sheeran, introducing him to skills and mindsets he never would have imagined he would later utilize back home. It was in this environment of constant stress and looming danger that Sheeran learned the ability to take orders without flinching and to carry out tasks he rarely questioned. Many veterans bore the scars of war, but Sheeran's scars were especially deep. War and the birth of painting houses. When Sheeran set foot in Sicily, then Italy, the reception he encountered was often marked by cautious resignation. Many Italian soldiers seemed on the verge of giving up, exhausted from the ongoing conflict. He noted that the Germans backing them offered the real backbone of the Axis resistance. As an American soldier, Sheeran became close to his fellow troops, Jewish, Italian, and others, forging bonds under the constant threat of annihilation. Yet nearly all of them perished before the war's end. This loss taught him a grim lesson. Never get too close to anyone, lest you face the unbearable pain of losing them. He learned a brand of detachment that would govern his later life. It was under the command of the controversial General Patton that Sheeran committed war crimes, executing surrendering soldiers who, in his eyes, clearly resembled him physically, an act that left him more detached than ever. This detachment turned into a readiness to paint houses, meaning to eliminate targets, a phrase eventually used in the realm of organized crime. Post-war chaos and return to civilian life. Sheeran, like many veterans, came back to an America that felt radically different from the one he left. The job market, once brimming with opportunity for men, had shifted drastically as women filled numerous roles. He found himself bored with safer assignments during the war and paid dearly for those decisions upon return. Now he tried to drive trucks and establish some sense of normalcy. The war, however, had left him with a temperament well suited to a different line of work, the violent tasks of the American underworld. With each passing year, he drifted toward people entrenched in that scene, though he was not yet a mobster or contract killer. His criminal tendencies remained subdued until a fateful encounter. First meeting with Russell Bufalino. In 1955, while Sheeran was on the job for food fare, his truck broke down. Attempting to fix an engine he barely understood, Sheeran encountered an unassuming older man who offered help. This man was Russell Bufalino, sometimes referred to in real Mafia stories as one of the more discreet and influential bosses in organized crime. Their handshake sealed a simple yet momentous alliance. Sheeran, though tall and imposing, showed respect to Bufalino, curious about the man's impressive aura. In turn, Bufalino appreciated Sheeran's politeness. Bufalino figured out Sheeran came from a military background, but had no knowledge of his own name's widespread headlines. Sheeran at first assumed Bufalino was just a kindly businessman, yet the street on which Sheeran's truck broke down was owned or heavily influenced by this quiet power. That day, a small spark ignited a relationship that would transform Sheeran's entire life. Russell Bufalino's shadowy domain? Russell Bufalino's involvement in the underworld had begun long before Sheeran ever stepped foot into that environment. He was an Italian immigrant from a coal mining background, which made him relatable to a workforce seeking better wages and conditions. As the decades passed, Bufalino cultivated ties in Hollywood, garment factories, and trucking unions, even forging alliances across different crime families, Gambino, Genovese, Bruno, Trafficante, and more. He avoided narcotics, a policy that earned him trust among both politicians and fellow bosses. And it was in the realm of labor unions, especially the Teamsters, that Bufalino left a huge mark. His endorsement opened doors, and his threats sealed deals in secret. Such relationships could catapult men like Jimmy Hoffa into the national spotlight. Jimmy Hoffa's meteoric rise? Jimmy Hoffa emerged from a hard-scrabble life. His father had died in a coal mine, leaving Hoffa with a fierce commitment to ensuring workers were treated fairly. Hoffa's talent for leadership soon manifested in the Teamsters Union. He had a clear sense of how to negotiate and was unafraid of more ruthless methods when faced with powerful forces like big businesses. Commandeering support from figures like Russell Bufalino and Carlo Gambino, he gained control over pension funds, forging useful alliances with organized crime. While many admired him for championing workers' rights, others saw the dark edges. Hoffa admitted at times to spilling a bit of beer, his metaphor for the bloodshed or intimidation that occasionally accompanied Union victories. He stepped on plenty of toes, from the automotive industry in Detroit to national corporations, building a reputation powerful enough to draw the attention of the White House. Organized crime at war with Washington? The 1960s ushered in an era when organized crime felt the federal government was openly challenging it. Politicians like Robert F. Kennedy zeroed in on figures like Hoffa. The Teamsters had soared to new heights and become a powerful force in the labor world. Their leader was no longer just a union icon. He was a national figure whose decisions affected everyday workers as well as infamous syndicates. Earlier in the 1950s, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had dismissed the idea of a national crime syndicate, but high-profile incidents like the shooting of Frank Costello and the murder of Albert Anastasia forced the public to acknowledge that these crime families operated with shocking impunity. The Appalachian Meeting in 1957, where law enforcement stormed a gathering of high-ranking mobsters, further confirmed the existence of a mafia presence. Men like Hoffa provided essential fronts for the underworld, unions, pension funds, and legitimate businesses through which criminals laundered money. Jimmy Hoffa and Richard Nixon? By the 1970s, Richard Nixon was in the White House. The Mafia saw a chance to negotiate more favorable terms, especially after the strife between organized crime and Washington under earlier administrations. Nixon's team perceived political advantages in working with big unions like the Teamsters, hoping for their electoral support. Hoffa's sentence for bribery did not stop Nixon from granting him a form of clemency on conditions. Some claimed that the Teamsters contributed large sums to Nixon's campaign. Hoffa was released, but forced to step aside from union activity for a period that would keep him away from leadership roles until 1980. Hoffa initially believed he could challenge that restriction in court. However, the labyrinth of backroom deals and political strategies made it difficult. Even as he left federal prison, he realized the union he once commanded had changed drastically, thanks to the influence of Frank Fitzsimmons and others who favored new alliances with certain mob bosses. Power shifts within the Teamsters? When a leader as forceful as Hoffa goes to prison, a power vacuum opens. That void was filled by men of varying loyalty, some more complicit with criminals than others. Figures like Tony Provenzano, who rose within the union but also stood as a captain in the Genovese crime family, highlighted how deeply woven organized crime could be in labor activity. These men manipulated pension funds for personal gain, redirecting millions into gambling ventures, real estate deals, and hush money. To outsiders, it looked like the Teamsters was a fortress of working-class empowerment. Behind closed doors, it had become a fortress for the underworld, too. This was the environment Hoffa re-entered, determined to reclaim his old power. Unresolved tensions and rivalries? Hoffa's depiction to the public had always been that of a union man, a staunch negotiator who refused to yield to threats. However, behind the scenes, rivalries erupted. Men like Provenzano resented the possibility of Hoffa's return, aware that his strong will could disrupt lucrative arrangements. In addition, those reading the political winds, like Russell Bufalino, observed that if Hoffa came back full force, he might talk about deeper secrets. Warnings circulated after John F. Kennedy's 1963 assassination. Some among the Mafia felt Hoffa might know more about these events, given his ties to so many high-profile figures. If he revealed what he knew, you'd open Pandora's box. For the Mafia, containing Hoffa was paramount. They recognized that accidents and unsolved mysteries were not uncommon tools in the underworld playbook. The Sheeran-Hoffa connection grows. While Hoffa was plotting his political and union comeback, Frank Sheeran's role began to expand. Russell Bufalino trusted Sheeran, employing him for delicate errands. Sheeran's military background, combined with that stoic drive, made him exceptionally dependable. Over time, Sheeran became closer to Hoffa himself. The union leader was known to keep strict discipline, especially prohibiting heavy drinking. Yet Sheeran, who occasionally indulged in wine, managed to maintain Hoffa's respect, delivering witty comebacks that disarmed Hoffa's suspicion. They developed a rapport that made others wonder. Hoffa was known to have a lighter side around children, caring about their innocence, a stark contrast to Sheeran's more stoic personality. In a sense, they matched each other's temperaments ironically well. Hoffa appreciated Sheeran's unwavering loyalty. Sheeran appreciated Hoffa's fatherly presence, something he lacked for much of his life. Castro, Mafia, and geopolitics? While the Teamsters and the mob wrestled with each other for influence, global politics lurked in the background. In the late 1950s, Fidel Castro rose to power in Cuba, claiming the island's gambling hotspots once controlled by crime families. Rumors swirled that Hoffa quietly supported the arming of Castro, thinking he might remain friendly to labor, only to discover that Castro soon seized mob assets. The diaspora of Mafia money looked for fresh territory, from Las Vegas to the Bahamas. Connections with politicians were vital. As the 1960 election approached, the Mafia used its voting power in places like Illinois, rumored to have turned the tide for John F. Kennedy's victory. Though Hoffa and the Teamsters had backed Nixon, some crime families still believed they could cut deals with the new Kennedy White House. But Robert F. Kennedy, appointed Attorney General, proved to be the toughest adversary organized crime had ever faced. The fierce Attorney General? Robert F. Kennedy's crusade was unstoppable in the early 1960s. He forced significant indictments against mobsters from various crime families. Seeing the unstoppable wave, many criminals realized that their prior alliances with the Kennedys were worthless. They had bet on an administration that would look aside, only to discover an administration that looked to bury them. Robert F. Kennedy famously developed a contempt for Hoffa, escalating investigations into union finances. Before prison, Hoffa paced the floors, barking into phones to try to hold back these legal assaults, but the tide was unrelenting. Significant figures like Sam Giancana in Chicago and Santo Trafficante in Florida felt the heat. Even men in high places, once protected by backroom deals, could no longer rest easy. This wave of accountability enraged those used to impunity. Scandals, bribes, and Edward Grady Parton? Hoffa was indicted multiple times, often skating free based on technicalities. Yet a figure named Edward Grady Parton, associated with the Teamsters in Louisiana, turned informant. He provided the inside look that Robert Kennedy's office needed. Parton wore a hidden wire and documented Hoffa's efforts at jury tampering. Hoffa's disdain for the Kennedys might have spurred him into risky behavior, but it paved his road to incarceration. When the guilty verdict finally came, it shook the entire Union. While Tony Provenzano and others had no problem surviving in prison, Hoffa despised being caged. He planned from the start to secure an early release and storm back. But as soon as he breathed free air, he collided with new adversaries who had grown comfortable in his absence. The volatile 1960s, political turmoil, civil rights, and violence. While the Mafia feuded with the Kennedys, the rest of the nation was boiling with civil rights movements, anti-war sentiment, and cultural revolution. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. Robert Kennedy was slain the same year, fueling conspiracy theories that pointed at the same underworld. The mob took advantage of the chaos, expanding drug markets and forging new alliances overseas. Meanwhile, the Teamsters discovered that big business needed them even more, giving them a golden chance to demand bigger contracts for truckers. This combination of legitimate labor negotiations and sinister underworld secrets propelled Hoffa, upon his release, to return as the rightful leader of the Teamsters. However, the men who had stepped into his shoes wanted him out of the way, or at least hobbled by legal constraints. The 1971 pardon and curtailed freedoms. Upon leaving prison, Hoffa realized how cunning his enemies could be. Although Nixon's administration allowed him out early, a clause prevented him from running a union until 1980. Hoffa suspected sabotage. Citing the Constitution, his lawyers argued that such a restriction was effectively imposing a new punishment. Hoffa threatened to challenge it in court, but grew cautious about drawing unwanted federal scrutiny. Large sums of money had allegedly changed hands to facilitate the arrangement. In public, Hoffa gave ambivalent remarks praising Nixon, while privately seething that he'd been betrayed by those he once called associates. Men who had risen under him turned their backs, eager to keep their own seats of power. Shattered alliances, Hoffa versus the mob. Despite these humiliations, Hoffa was not one to be silenced. He threatened lawsuits, leaked hints of unearthing past crimes, or strongly hinted that he'd drag down others if they tried to keep him locked out. Figures like Carlos Marcello, Tony Provenzano, and even the quiet but potent Russell Bufalino began feeling uneasy. The mob typically disliked attention, and if Hoffa's attempts to retake the Teamsters involved disclosing under-the-table deals, it could bring the entire house down. By 1972, Hoffa's frustration boiled over. He criticized how the union had turned into a bank for gangsters. He made phone calls suggesting that he might openly defy the clause in his pardon. In segments of the union and the underworld, talk spread that Hoffa was a liability. A nation's distrust of government? Watergate overshadowed these developments, but it also stoked broader cynicism. Leaked details from the CIA and FBI pointed toward previous collaborations with the Mafia to remove Castro. Citizens saw powerful men in suits spinning tall tales, fueling unsolved mysteries about assassinations and corruption. In that climate, the public was primed to believe shocking revelations about big labor or the Mafia. Hoffa's knowledge threatened to blow the lid off hidden alliances. People in power recognized a man like Hoffa, bursting with resentments and willing to use any means, could cause permanent damage if he decided to go public. Meanwhile, Frank Sheeran watched from the sidelines, loyal to both Bufalino and Hoffa, but torn by intensifying friction. Violent escalations and retaliations. What made the mid-1970s dangerous was the spike in violent tactics. Car bombings, shootings, sabotage, these brutal acts no longer happened in the shadows alone. Rivalries flared among leaders within the Teamsters. Many had ties to infamous syndicates in Chicago, Detroit, New York, Miami, or Philadelphia. The FBI, more active than ever, raided mob hideouts, seized documents, and discovered shady financial dealings. Frank Sheeran's loyalty was tested repeatedly. He had to weigh his devotion to Russell Bufalino, who demanded silence and compliance, against Hoffa, who claimed to stand for the working man. The war turned personal. Kidnappings, threats to families, and punishing those refusing to turn over union accounts. The rumor mill suggested the Mafia had grown so concerned about Hoffa's next moves that they were prepared to act preemptively. The disappearance that shook America? Then came the day that etched Hoffa's name into the annals of crime families' lore. He vanished. On July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa was last seen outside a suburban Detroit restaurant, supposedly there to meet two men, allegedly Anthony Giacalone and Anthony Provenzano, among others. Whether they actually met him remains uncertain. He was never seen in public again. People recognized the potential for an explosive confrontation if the meeting took place. If Hoffa felt double-crossed, he might have lost his temper, and in that gangster-laced environment, such explosion could be lethal. The underworld had no shortage of contract killers, hitmen adept at painting houses. The FBI launched investigations. Decades later, the disappearance reigned as one of America's most high-profile, unsolved mysteries. Public fascination soared, generating countless theories from credible to outlandish. Maybe he was buried under a stadium, or encased in cement, or hidden in some remote woodland. None of these theories were confirmed. Frank Sheeran's confession? Years down the line, Frank Sheeran famously admitted to personally taking Hoffa's life, describing in detail how loyalty to Russell Bufalino compelled him to follow that lethal order. Some believe Sheeran's tale, others doubt he had the nerve or personal involvement. True crime enthusiasts and those enthralled by real mafia stories debate the truth. Did Sheeran carry it out by himself? Or was it a group effort involving organized crime's top enforcers? The swirl of possibilities continues, with each new revelation or confession adding to the puzzle. Nevertheless, Sheeran insisted that only he bore the burden of shooting Hoffa, describing it like any other job done silently to maintain the code of the mob. From a historical standpoint, Sheeran's admission served as an unsettling capstone to a life shaped by unwavering compliance, a trait honed in wartime and used on the violent streets of post-war USA. Hoffa's legacy and the Teamsters? Hoffa's fate overshadowed his earlier achievements. He had forged an American union empire that secured higher wages, pensions, and medical benefits for countless truck drivers and laborers. He had dragged those working men from vulnerable negotiations to a place of formidable bargaining power, championing them against industries that once refused to budge. But it all came at a steep price. The infiltration of organized crime, the forging of shady alliances, and the unstoppable ambition that overshadowed union ideals, these shaped his legacy more than his many deals. Some sincere admirers believed he genuinely cared about the working class and never intended for the Mafia's involvement to spiral so horribly. Others argued he was always comfortable with intimidation if it advanced his agenda. Dark history and underworld secrets? Across America, people linked Hoffa's disappearance to a broader tapestry. A dark history of labor corruption, political misdeeds, unsolved mysteries, and most chillingly, murder as a tool of secrecy. Organized crime was so enmeshed with daily life, despite official denials, that mainstream society felt the tremors of each mafia feud. The 1970 RICO statute gave prosecutors a powerful tool to dismantle the structure of these crime families. Still, the disappearance of Hoffa was proof that the mob's reach remained formidable. The synergy of criminals and unscrupulous labor officials had endured for decades, from Prohibition to the Teamsters, and continued to vex investigators even after high-profile arrests. It was a testament to American society's difficulty in severing the link between big money, power, and intimidation. Joe Valachi's bold revelations. In the early 1960s, another insider, Joe Valachi, broke the code of silence by testifying about La Cosa Nostra before the McClellan Committee. Valachi's testimony, though overshadowed by later events, offered the public a glimpse into the Mafia's workings, how they structured themselves, how they sorted out territory, and how leadership changed after big shootings or arrests. Though Valachi's revelations predated Hoffa's disappearance, they paved the way for the government to aggressively investigate suspects. No longer could the Mafia wave away allegations as fantasies. The mob responded by tightening its lips as best it could, yet figures like Russell Bufalino stayed out of the limelight. His anonymity helped him remain powerful, unless the likes of Hoffa threatened to speak too loudly. Kennedy assassination links? The oath-bound secrecy of the underworld becomes more complex if you connect it to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Rumors circulated for decades that certain mobsters felt betrayed by the Kennedys. After all, the Mafia allegedly assisted in questionable campaign matters, only to face unrelenting crackdowns from Robert Kennedy once they were in office. The lethal chain of events that culminated in 1963 left a permanent scar on American society. The Warren Commission insisted Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, but conspiracy theories never died, partly because the forces at play, Mafia, CIA, anti-Castro exiles, remained shrouded in secrecy. Hoffa's name often crept into these theories, fueling speculation that he held data about the plot, giving him blackmail leverage. For the Mafia, controlling that knowledge was critical. Watergate, paranoia, and government leaks. Just as the Mafia attempted to handle threats of exposure, the administration under Richard Nixon faced a meltdown of its own making. The Watergate burglary and subsequent cover-up introduced an era of unprecedented leaks, including details about CIA involvement in foreign assassination attempts. The real scandal was the erosion of faith in institutions. In that vacuum, rumors about the Mafia and unscrupulous government deals found fertile ground. The public believed that if the White House was complicit in break-ins and hush money, it might also be complicit in turning a blind eye to organized crime. Organized crime took advantage of the confusion, continuing to launder money, manipulate union pension funds, and expand operations. This environment heightened the tension around Hoffa's eventual attempt to blow the whistle on union corruption. Hoffa's final days. As the newly freed Hoffa wandered around big cities, from Detroit to Miami, planning rallies to resurrect his influence, accounts suggest he received warnings. Vague references to let it go or stay retired peppered his phone calls. Hoffa, stubborn as ever, refused submission. He placed calls to old contacts, hammered out potential new deals, threatened lawsuits, and demanded to see Teamster records. In private circles, Tony Provenzano and others from the Genovese family fumed. Carlos Marcello was said to be alarmed if Hoffa truly talked about the Kennedys. The same could be said for RICO-connected families in Chicago or New York. Russell Bufalino's cautious approach, preferring subtlety, clashed with Hoffa's outbursts. On that July evening in 1975, all of these undercurrents likely converged. Enduring mysteries? Although decades have passed since that day, the story is never over. Investigators, journalists, union workers, and curiosity seekers keep picking at the threads, sometimes digging up yards or tearing down abandoned buildings, chasing the slightest rumor. Hollywood portrayals of Hoffa's saga continue to stoke fascination in underworld secrets. Every so often, a new tip or deathbed confession emerges, only for the trail to run cold. The FBI has kept the Hoffa file open for years, though it's widely thought that the truth is known but unprovable in court. Numerous criminals suspected in his vanishing died in the 1980s or 1990s. Sheeran's admission, contained in his later testimony, served as the closest thing to closure, but many question if it was simply Sheeran's desire for final recognition. Frank Sheeran's complex legacy? Sheeran went from a foot soldier in a global war to a quiet killer in a hidden one. In the saga of real Mafia stories, his unique presence, an Irish-American welcomed into an environment largely dominated by Italian and Jewish mobsters, was a testament to his capacity for violence, loyalty, and linguistic adaptability. He had gained acceptance partly thanks to his fluency in Italian, which impressed Russell Bufalino. Over the years, Sheeran struggled with moral reflection about hardened war veterans leading peaceful post-war lives, while he thrived on the readiness for brutality. If Sheeran's confessions stand, it was that readiness that ended Hoffa's life. "I heard you paint houses," Hoffa might have casually said at one point, a phrase full of chilling subtext about Sheeran's bloody skill set. A labyrinth of notorious kingpins. Throughout this entire narrative, an array of organized crime figures float into and out of the picture. Carlo Gambino orchestrating mob expansions, Tony Accardo in Chicago controlling rackets with an iron fist, Sam Giancana's flamboyant style, Angelo Bruno's quiet approach in Philadelphia, mafia families across the country jockeying for power, and smaller groups vying for scraps. They were all dealing with labor unions in one way or another, channeling money into pockets, alliances to ensure that their gambling dens and hotels from Vegas to Atlantic City thrived. Then you have politicians, some manipulated by blackmail, others paid off with sweet union loans, and a few, like the Kennedys, defiant enough to fight back. This intricate puzzle of deals, vendettas, power moves, and illusions frames the entire era as a labyrinth of unstoppable greed and ambition. Unanswered questions and the future? In the end, there is no shortage of questions. Did Hoffa, in a final act of desperation, threaten men like Tony Provenzano enough to push them over the edge? Did Russell Bufalino demand Sheeran cut short their once close friendship? Did the government turn a blind eye, relieved to see a potential agitator gone for good? Each question yields a tangle of theories, each more layered than the last. The line between a righteous cause, organizing workers, and a sinister racket was never truly clear in Hoffa's time. The Teamsters grew into a major union, raising wages, providing health plans, granting pensions. Yet the same pension fund financed Mafia-run casinos, fueling expansions in Las Vegas and other locales. These complexities shaped the public view of unionization. Was it championing the working class or feeding corruption? Hoffa's story crystallizes that ambiguity. National reflection on dark history? The story of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance remains a linchpin for reflecting on the mid-20th century in America. It was an age bursting with seismic shifts in civil rights, technological leaps, and unstoppable consumer culture. Meanwhile, men in tailored suits met in back rooms, forging unholy alliances that shape the fortunes of millions. The underworld and mainstream society were never truly separate during this period. They overlapped at restaurants, card tables, sports arenas, and union halls. Presidents were swayed by union endorsements, union leaders were swayed by gangster money, and gangster money was fed by the greed of corporate players. Everything was intricately connected, so much so that any attempt to isolate one piece, like removing Hoffa from the equation, upset a precarious balance. Perhaps it was that fear, the dread that Hoffa might topple the structure once he returned, that sealed his fate. The unyielding popular fascination. Decade after decade, books, films, newspaper articles, and investigative series feed the public's endless appetite for Hoffa. In the realm of unsolved mysteries, his disappearance stands out because it merges labor politics, mob intrigue, and possible political conspiracies. It invites speculation on whether there was a grander design behind the incident or if it simply emerged out of personal grudges. School children sometimes hear the name Jimmy Hoffa in jokes about searching beneath stadiums, but that's a testament to how deeply his story has penetrated American culture. Historians weigh the significance of the labor strides against the overshadowing presence of his criminal entanglements. True crime fans debate the details of that day in 1975, layering each theory with new bits of anecdotal evidence. A legacy studded with contradictions? Hoffa was a man who demanded loyalty, who was fearless in confronting corporate executives and equally fearless in forging alliances with criminals. He had a genuine interest in the welfare of truck drivers around the nation, working tirelessly to secure their pensions. Yet those same pension funds became the piggy bank of notorious kingpins, funneled to questionable real estate. He outwardly opposed corruption in some public statements, but accepted the presence of men with murder on their resumes. The starkest contradiction might be that a man who championed the working class ended up led astray by the underworld. In that sense, his story stands as a cautionary tale about letting ambition and bitterness overshadow genuine purpose. Sheeran's final reflections. How did Frank Sheeran reconcile the memory of Hoffa? Some accounts suggest a deep remorse settled upon him in later years. Others propose that he never wavered from seeing his actions as just following orders. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Those final confessions, given in interviews or recounted in published works, paint a portrait of a man weighed down by the cumulative horrors of a life in violence. He had endured the chaos of World War II, lost friends on the battlefield, then returned to face an underworld that felt like a new war altogether. Sheeran's war never ended. It just changed shape once he traded olive-drab fatigues for plain suits. And so the line between national hero and underworld enforcer blurred, enduring enigmas and shifting allegiances. From the vantage point of modern audiences, it's easy to see the past as a swirling mass of alliances formed and broken, of men speaking in code, of large envelopes stuffed with cash exchanging hands. Indeed, that's the reality Hoffa and Sheeran inhabited. A murky labyrinth where federal investigators tapped phones, politicians tried to curry favor, and mob bosses used cunning to preserve their slice of the American dream. The ultimate question is, who, if anyone, truly won? If the measure is raw legacy, the Mafia eventually faced crippling prosecutions. The Teamsters remain a potent union, but different from Hoffa's day. Meanwhile, millions remain riveted by the disappearance of one man, and the incomplete nature of that story resonates as strongly as ever. Ripples through history. Events triggered by Hoffa's disappearance shape how we interpret union activism and the infiltration by crime families. Hardline approaches from law enforcement forced criminal syndicates to adapt or fade. Some watchers believe that if Hoffa had remained in power, the Teamsters might have reigned even mightier. Some believe his downfall was orchestrated partly by men seeking to subvert what was once a tool for the working class. Others see Hoffa as a pivotal figure who ironically helped unify law enforcement efforts against Mafia infiltration, since his controversies made the public demand reforms. In any case, the historical footprints left by these men are gigantic, not easily erased by a missing body or shredded documents. Conclusion: a haunting legacy? In the panorama of dark history, Hoffa and Sheeran hold a corner all their own. One was the outward face of Union might, at once revered and feared. The other drifted from humble soldier to quiet assassin, bridging the gap between labor's public champion and the hidden muscle of the underworld. Together, they crossed paths with an astounding cast of characters. Political leaders, crime bosses, government agents, every layer of the American power structure. The end result is one of the most captivating underworld secrets the United States has ever seen. Hoffa's vanished presence still lingers. Did Frank Sheeran indeed pull the trigger? Did high-ranking mobsters orchestrate it? Were they just part of a bigger conspiracy? Even decades later, these questions remain, enthralling all who delve into the labyrinthine details. This is the story of men who wielded enormous influence and paid the steepest price, leaving behind a true crime saga unparalleled in magnitude and mystery.